What you're about to witness defies everything you think you know about diplomatic immunity and royal protocol. This is the story of how a single moment of British restraint silenced an international incident before it could begin and taught a powerful lesson about the difference between authority and arrogance. Ambassador Viktor Kozlov had never met a rule he couldn't bend. In his 20-year career climbing the ranks of international diplomacy, he'd learned that protocols were suggestions, boundaries were negotiations, and sovereign immunity was his personal key to any door in the world. His polished shoes had walked through restricted zones in 43 countries. His diplomatic passport had opened paths that ordinary mortals could never dream of accessing. But today, those shoes would stop at a line drawn not in sand or ink, but in something far more permanent: British tradition. The morning air was crisp as autumn leaves danced around the ornate gates of Buckingham Palace. Kozlov emerged from his armored diplomatic vehicle, straightening his hand-tailored Italian suit and adjusting cufflinks that cost more than most people's monthly salaries. Behind him, his security detail fanned out with practiced efficiency, their eyes scanning for threats that would never come from the direction they were watching. The ambassador's mission was simple, at least in his mind. A private meeting with a member of the royal household had been arranged through proper channels. But Kozlov had arrived early, and he had never been the type to wait. Patience was for people who lacked the power to make their own schedules. The royal guard stood at his post with the stillness of granite carved by masters. His scarlet uniform blazed against the gray stone of the palace walls, every brass button polished to mirror brightness, every seam pressed to razor sharpness. This was precision made flesh, duty embodied in wool and brass and unwavering resolve. Kozlov approached with the confident stride of a man accustomed to deference. In his world, recognition was automatic, paths cleared themselves, and conversations began with "Yes, Your Excellency," rather than questions about authorization. Today would be different, but he didn't know that yet. "Good morning," the ambassador announced in English flavored with the particular accent that marked him as educated at prestigious international schools. "I have business inside, official diplomatic business." The guard's eyes remained fixed on the horizon. Not a flicker of acknowledgement, not the slightest indication that words had been spoken or that another human being stood mere feet away. This was more than professional discipline. This was the embodiment of a system that had outlasted empires, survived world wars, and maintained its dignity through centuries of change. Kozlov's eyebrows rose with the kind of surprise that powerful people experience when the world fails to rearrange itself around their presence. He reached into his jacket and withdrew his diplomatic passport, the burgundy cover embossed with gold lettering that had opened doors from Moscow to Washington to Beijing. "Perhaps you didn't hear me," he said, his voice carrying a subtle edge that his subordinates would have recognized as dangerous. "I am Ambassador Viktor Kozlov. I have diplomatic immunity and official business. I require immediate passage." Still, the guard remained motionless. His rifle held at precisely the regulation angle, his white gloves spotless against the dark metal, his breathing so controlled that his chest barely seemed to move. This wasn't ignorance or rudeness or failure to understand the situation. This was something far more profound, the absolute certainty that duty transcended politics, protocol, and personal convenience. The morning crowd of tourists began to notice the developing confrontation. Phones emerged from pockets with the speed of reflexes honed by social media culture. Here was drama unfolding in real time, power meeting power, authority challenging authority in a setting that promised historic significance. Kozlov stepped closer, close enough that the gold thread in his diplomatic insignia caught the morning light. Close enough that his expensive cologne mixed with the autumn air. Close enough to make his presence impossible to ignore by any reasonable standard of human interaction. "I am speaking to you," he declared, his voice now carrying the full weight of diplomatic authority. "I represent a sovereign nation. You will acknowledge my presence and grant me passage immediately." The words hung in the air like smoke from ancient cannons, carrying the implicit threat of international incident, diplomatic complaint, formal protest through proper channels. These were the tools that had shaped Kozlov's career, the weapons of soft power that had bent the will of generals and presidents and prime ministers. But the Guard absorbed those words the same way ancient stone absorbs rain, completely, silently, without visible effect or lasting change. His discipline had been forged in training that broke lesser men, tested in conditions that would have sent diplomats running for their armored cars. This was not a man who could be intimidated by titles or threats or the promise of consequences. For the first time in decades, Viktor Kozlov encountered something his authority could not penetrate. The realization came slowly, like dawn breaking over a landscape he had never seen before. This wasn't about diplomatic protocol or international law or sovereign immunity. This was about something deeper, older, more fundamental than any treaty or agreement between nations. The Guard's partner, stationed at the opposite post, maintained his own perfect stillness. But there was something in his posture that suggested awareness, solidarity, the quiet confidence of men who served something greater than political expediency. This wasn't just one guard dealing with one difficult visitor. This was an institution responding to challenge in the way institutions should, with quiet, unshakable resolve. Kozlov reached for his phone, the gesture sharp with frustration and growing anger. He would call his contacts, invoke proper channels, remind these people about the consequences of insulting diplomatic representatives. The device felt heavy in his hands, weighted with the power to launch formal complaints that could reach the highest levels of government. But before he could dial, something happened that changed everything. The Guard moved, not his body, not his head, not even his expression, just his eyes, shifting with glacial slowness from their fixed point on the horizon to meet Kozlov's gaze directly. It was such a small movement that most of the gathering crowd missed it entirely. But the ambassador felt the full force of that attention like a physical weight. In those pale blue eyes, Kozlov saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. Not anger or hostility or even recognition of his diplomatic status. He saw something far more devastating, complete and utter indifference to everything he represented. This wasn't personal animosity or national prejudice or bureaucratic stubbornness. This was the gaze of a man who had seen real power, had served alongside real authority, had dedicated his life to principles that transcended political convenience. And in that gaze, all of Kozlov's certificates and credentials and diplomatic immunity were revealed to be exactly what they truly were, pieces of paper. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither could cross. Around them, the morning routine of the palace continued unchanged. Guards at other posts maintained their vigilance. Tourists snapped their photographs. Life moved forward with the steady rhythm of centuries, unmarked by this moment of diplomatic friction. But for Kozlov, everything had stopped. In his career, he had met presidents and premiers, kings and queens, leaders who commanded armies and controlled the fate of nations. Yet none of them had ever looked at him with such complete, devastating indifference to his importance. The phone in his hand felt suddenly meaningless. The contacts in his directory, the officials who took his calls, the networks of influence he had spent decades building, all of it seemed small and petty against the quiet dignity of the man standing before him. Then, with the same glacial precision with which they had moved to meet his, the Guard's eyes returned to the horizon. The moment of contact was over, but its impact would last forever. Kozlov had been evaluated, measured, and found to be exactly what he was, a man who had confused position with worth, authority with dignity, power with strength. The ambassador stood there for another long minute, his expensive suit suddenly feeling like a costume, his diplomatic credentials heavy as lead in his breast pocket. Around him, the world continued its ancient rhythm, but he felt as if he were standing outside time itself, looking at his entire career through different eyes. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with the weight of centuries, with the accumulated dignity of an institution that had outlasted revolutions, survived world wars, and maintained its standards through the rise and fall of empires. Kozlov felt that weight pressing down on him like the atmosphere of an alien planet. His security detail, trained to read situations and respond to threats, began to shift uncomfortably. They had witnessed their principal navigate diplomatic crises in volatile regions, handle hostile negotiations with enemy states, and maintain his composure under circumstances that would have broken lesser men. But they had never seen him rendered speechless by a single glance from an unarmed soldier. The morning crowd had grown larger, drawn by the unmistakable tension of confrontation. But this wasn't the kind of confrontation they expected. There were no raised voices, no dramatic gestures, no obvious displays of power or authority. Just two men standing in silence, one representing the weight of diplomatic protocol, the other embodying something far older and more enduring. Kozlov's mind raced through his options, each one dissolving as quickly as it formed. He could demand to speak to superior officers, but the guard's silence had already made clear that rank meant nothing here. He could invoke international law, but laws were words on paper, and this man served something that transcended legislation. He could threaten diplomatic consequences, but threats required an audience willing to be threatened. For the first time in his career, Viktor Kozlov was completely out of tools. The realization came like cold water in his veins. All his life, he had operated in a world where everything was negotiable, where every rule had exceptions, where sufficient pressure applied at the correct leverage points could move any obstacle. But standing before him was proof that some things in this world were truly immovable. He looked more closely at the guard, really seeing him for the first time. This wasn't a ceremonial figure or a tourist attraction. This was a professional soldier who had chosen to dedicate his life to service. The kind of service that required standing perfectly still 4 hours regardless of weather, dealing with thousands of tourists without losing composure, maintaining standards even when no one was watching. The contrast was devastating. Here was a man who served something greater than himself, while Kozlov had spent decades serving primarily his own advancement. Here was someone who had mastered self-discipline, while the ambassador had mastered the manipulation of others. Here was dignity earned through sacrifice, standing before arrogance purchased with position. A child in the growing crowd pointed at the two men and asked his father in heavily accented English, "Daddy, why is the man in the suit angry at the soldier?" The father's response carried across the courtyard with the clarity of innocence, cutting through complexity, because, son, some people think their titles make them more important than other people's duties. The words hit Kozlov like physical blows. Out of the mouths of babes and foreign tourists came truths that diplomatic training had never taught him to recognize. He was angry at the guard. Not because the guard had done anything wrong, but because the guard refused to acknowledge that diplomatic credentials made Kozlov special. But what if they didn't? What if all his certificates and immunity and official status were just conveniences granted by governments that could be revoked as easily as they had been bestowed? What if real dignity came not from the recognition of others, but from the strength of one's own character? The guard's breathing remained steady, measured, controlled. But Kozlov noticed something he had missed before. The man's eyes, though fixed on the horizon, were constantly moving. Not his head, not his neck, but his eyes were tracking movement, assessing threats, maintaining awareness of everything happening in his field of responsibility. This wasn't mindless statue duty. This was active, intelligent vigilance performed by someone who took his responsibility seriously. Someone who understood that protection meant more than just standing in place looking impressive. Someone whose duty encompassed not just physical security, but the preservation of dignity, tradition, and the standards that made civilization possible. "Sir," one of his security officers whispered urgently, "perhaps we should contact the embassy. Arrange proper channels. Kozlov held up a hand to silence him. For the first time since arriving, he wasn't thinking about proper channels or diplomatic protocol or the most efficient way to achieve his objectives. He was thinking about something else entirely: respect. When had he last shown genuine respect to another human being? Not the performative deference required by diplomatic protocol, not the strategic courtesy designed to achieve specific goals, but actual respect for another person's dignity and worth. The question hung in his mind like an indictment. In his rise through the diplomatic ranks, respect had become a currency to be spent strategically rather than a fundamental acknowledgement of human worth. He had learned to deploy it as a tool, to withhold it as punishment, to grant it as reward. But standing before this guard, he was reminded that respect wasn't something you gave or withheld based on personal advantage. It was something you either possessed or you didn't. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the palace courtyard. The light caught the brass buttons on the guard's uniform, the pristine white of his gloves, the perfect symmetry of his posture. Every detail spoke of pride in service, commitment to standards, dedication to something larger than personal comfort or convenience. Kozlov found himself studying his own reflection in the palace windows. His expensive suit looked well-tailored, but somehow less impressive than military wool. His diplomatic credentials felt substantial in his pocket, but somehow less meaningful than a simple oath of service. His entire career suddenly seemed less like achievement and more like elaborate self-promotion. The tourists around them were taking photographs, but not in the casual, happy way typical of sightseeing. There was something solemn about the moment they were capturing, something that suggested they understood they were witnessing more than just a diplomatic inconvenience. They were seeing the collision of two worldviews, one that believed power came from position, and one that knew power came from purpose. Then something extraordinary happened. From somewhere in the growing crowd came the sound of slow, deliberate clapping. Just one person at first, but the applause spread like ripples in a pond. Within moments, dozens of tourists from dozens of countries were applauding not Kozlov's diplomatic status or his expensive suit or his official credentials. They were applauding the guard's quiet dignity. The sound washed over the courtyard like a wave, and Kozlov felt it crash over him with devastating force. This was his audience. These were witnesses to his humiliation, and they were taking sides. But they weren't choosing based on nationality or politics or diplomatic immunity. They were choosing based on character, and they had chosen the man who served over the man who demanded service. The applause died away slowly, leaving behind a silence that felt different than before. Not empty or tense, but pregnant with possibility, with the chance for understanding, with the opportunity for something resembling redemption. Kozlov looked once more at the guard, and this time he saw not an obstacle to be overcome, but a teacher offering lessons he had never thought he needed to learn. Lessons about duty and dignity, and what it meant to serve something greater than oneself. For the first time in his diplomatic career, Viktor Kozlov considered the possibility that he might be wrong. The transformation began with a single step backward. Not a retreat, but something else entirely: recognition. Kozlov moved away from the guard not in defeat, but in understanding, his expensive shoes clicking against cobblestones that had witnessed centuries of similar moments when power learned humility. "Your Excellency," his chief security officer whispered urgently, "we can still contact the Foreign Office, file a formal complaint about this obstruction." But Kozlov raised his hand again, this time with finality. "No," he said quietly, his voice carrying a different quality than it had just minutes before. No complaints, no formal channels, no diplomatic protests. The officer looked confused, as did the rest of his security detail. In their experience, Ambassador Kozlov responded to obstacles with overwhelming force, diplomatic or otherwise. Retreat was not in his vocabulary. Acceptance was not part of his strategy. Yet here he stood, apparently ready to walk away from a confrontation he could easily win through proper channels. "Sir," the officer pressed, "you're meeting inside ... will happen when it is supposed to happen. Kozlov finished, his eyes still fixed on the guard who had taught him more in 10 minutes of silence than decades of diplomatic training had managed to convey. Through proper channels, with proper respect for the people whose job it is to maintain security and protocol. The words felt strange in his mouth, as if he were speaking a foreign language he was only beginning to learn. Respect for people whose job it was to serve rather than to command. Acknowledgement that duty performed with dignity deserved recognition regardless of rank or status. The crowd around them had grown quiet, sensing that the confrontation was resolving itself in an unexpected way. Phones continued to record, but the energy had shifted from anticipation of conflict to witnessing something rarer, the moment when pride gives way to wisdom. Kozlov reached into his jacket and withdrew his diplomatic passport, the burgundy leather still warm from his body heat. For 20 years, this document had been his skeleton key to the world, his guarantee of special treatment, his proof that he mattered more than ordinary people with ordinary problems. He looked at it now with different eyes. It was still valuable, still necessary for his work, still a symbol of his country's trust in his abilities. But it wasn't what made him worthy of respect. It was simply a tool, like a hammer or a computer or any other instrument that helped people do their jobs effectively. The real question was what kind of job he was doing with that tool. Was he building bridges between nations or simply opening doors for his own convenience? Was he serving his country's interests or just his own career advancement? Was he worthy of the trust that passport represented? I apologize, he said, speaking directly to the guard for the first time with actual respect rather than expectation of deference. I forgot that duty is duty, regardless of who stands before it. Your commitment to your post honors your service and your country. The guard's response was imperceptible to most observers. Just the slightest straightening of shoulders that were already perfectly straight, the smallest deepening of focus in eyes that were already laser precise in their attention. But to someone trained in reading human behavior, trained in the subtle languages of diplomacy and respect, it was as clear as if he had spoken volumes. The acknowledgement had been received, the apology had been accepted, the lesson had been learned. Kozlov turned to face his security detail, men who had served with him for years and had never seen him back down from any challenge, diplomatic or otherwise. Their confusion was evident, but so was something else, a glimmer of respect for a boss who had chosen wisdom over ego. Gentlemen, he said, we will return to the embassy and arrange this meeting through proper channels. As we should have done from the beginning, the walk back to their armored vehicle felt different than the confident stride that had brought them here. Not defeated, but somehow lighter, as if a weight Kozlov hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted from his shoulders. Behind them, the royal guard returned his full attention to his duty, unchanged by the encounter, but somehow validated by it. His quiet dignity had accomplished something that no amount of diplomatic negotiation could have achieved. It had reminded a powerful man that power without honor was just noise. The story spread quickly through diplomatic circles, as such stories always do. But it wasn't told as a tale of British rudeness or ceremonial inflexibility. Instead, it became something else, a reminder that true authority comes not from the positions we hold, but from how we honor the positions that others hold. Kozlov's meeting with the royal household took place 3 days later, arranged through entirely proper channels with all appropriate protocols observed. It was successful, productive, and conducted with a level of mutual respect that surprised everyone involved. But the real meeting, the one that mattered most, had already taken place in that palace courtyard, between a man who had confused position with worth and another who understood that worth could only be earned through service. Between someone who demanded respect and someone who embodied it. In the months that followed, colleagues noticed changes in Ambassador Kozlov's approach to his work. He listened more carefully to junior staff. He treated security personnel with the same courtesy he showed to heads of state. He began to understand that diplomacy, at its best, wasn't about wielding power, but about recognizing the dignity inherent in every person he encountered. The guard never learned about these changes, never knew that his silent lesson had rippled outward through embassies and foreign ministries, influencing how one small part of the diplomatic world conducted its business. He simply continued to do his duty, day after day, shift after shift, serving something larger than himself with quiet, unshakable dignity. But somewhere in London, mounted on the wall of a diplomatic office, a burgundy passport sits in a place of honor, not as a trophy of power achieved, but as a reminder of a lesson learned. A reminder that true authority serves others rather than demanding to be served. And sometimes late at night when the embassy is quiet and the work of nations pauses for a few precious hours, Viktor Kozlov looks at that passport and remembers the moment when silence taught him more than all his years of speaking had ever managed to do. The moment when a royal guard, without saying a word, without moving a muscle, without even acknowledging his presence, had shown him what dignity really looked like. And in that remembering, something precious is preserved. Something that can't be negotiated away, or lost in translation, or forgotten in the press of urgent business. The understanding that some things in this world are sacred not because they are powerful, but because they serve power with honor. The guard had one without fighting, taught without speaking, and changed the world one diplomat at a time simply by being exactly what he had sworn to be, a guardian of something worth protecting. In the end, that was lesson enough for any man, no matter what passport he carried.